Now, today we are going to discuss about the anatomy of the clavicle. Clavicle, as we have discussed, that it is a long bone. The definition of the long bone is the bone which contains two heads and a shaft. Since clavicle contains two heads and a shaft, therefore it is called a long bone. Now, we discuss the anatomy and osteology of the clavicle. The clavicle contains two heads, that is lateral head and a medial head. A lateral head and a medial head. The lateral head is a flattened head, whereas the medial end is quadrangular in shape. Okay, now the clavicle, the bone of clavicle and the shaft of clavicle is concavo-convex in shape. The most important point for the BCQ point of view is that the clavicle is concave in its lateral one third, where it is convex in its medial two third. It is convex in its medial two third, whereas concave in lateral one third. Now we discuss the surfaces of clavicle. The clavicle contains an anterior surface, a posterior surface, a lateral and a posterior surface, an anterior surface, a superior surface, and an inferior surface. Now, if suppose this one is a clavicle, now let me tell you, just let me discuss, which is now just just think that this is the superior surface, this is the superior surface, this is the posterior surface, this is the anterior surface, this is the lateral end, this is the medial end, this is the medial end, this is the lateral end, this is the anterior surface, this is the anterior surface, this is the posterior surface, this is the lateral end, this is the medial end, this is the superior surface. Now if we want to see the inferior surface, we have to rotate the bone like this, then this one is the inferior surface. Okay, now this one will be the lateral end, this one will be the medial end, this one will be the anterior surface, and this one will be the posterior surface. Okay, now let us discuss about the attachments of the clavicle. The attachments of clavicle is that the clavicle contains a deltoid muscle in its anterior lateral one third anterior surface, in its lateral one third part it contains a deltoid muscle, whereas on posterior surface it contains a trapezoid muscle. I have drawn the trapezius muscle with the blue color because it shows the insertion of trapezius in the clavicle. Now the clavicle contains a deltoid muscle on its anterior surface of the lateral one third, whereas a trapezius muscle on the posterior surface of the lateral one third. Similarly, the clavicle contains a pectoralis major on its anterior surface of the medial two third. A clavicle contains a pectoralis major on the anterior surface of the medial two third, whereas it contains a sternohyoid muscle on the posterior surface of the medial two third. A sternocleidomastoid muscle, sternohyoid muscle on the posterior surface of the medial two third of the clavicle. A sternocleidomastoid muscle is present on the superior surface. Sternocleidomastoid muscle is present on the superior surface. Okay, now if we rotate the bone to see the inferior surface, we can see a conoid tubercle, an elevation in the bone like this, a conoid tubercle, and a depression called the trapezoid ridge. A conoid tubercle and a trapezoid ridge. The conoid tubercle and the trapezoid ridge are connected together through the coracoclavicular ligament, whereas on the medial side we see a hollow impression called subclavian groove. This groove contains a subclavian muscle, whereas a impression for a costoclavicular ligament. Here a costoclavicular ligament attaches. Now we discuss about the joints that clavicle forms. The clavicle attaches from its lateral head. That is flattened head, through to the acromion process of the scapula. Acromion process of scapula to form acromioclavicular joint. to form acromioclavicular joint. Now, the medial head of the clavicle, attaches with the manubrium sterni, manubrium sterni of the sternum to form sternoclavicular joint. Sternoclavicular joint. Now, what we have discussed yet is that the clavicle contains two heads, that is lateral head and a medial head. The lateral head is flattened, whereas the medial hand is quadrangular in shape. It is concavo-convex in shape. The lateral end is 1/3, whereas the medial end is 2/3. Now we discuss about the surfaces of the clavicle. The clavicle contains an anterior surface, a posterior surface, a lateral end, a medial end, and the superior surface. If we rotate the bone just like this, completely around 360, we can see the inferior surface. At the inferior surface, it contains this one is called trapezoid ridge, and another tubercle which is called the conoid tubercle. The conoid tubercle and the trapezoid ridge are joined together by the coracoclavicular ligament and an impression for the subclavian impression for subclavius muscle and the costoclavicular ligament. Now we have seen that the lateral end forms joint with the acromion process of the scapula to form acromioclavicular joint, whereas the medial end forms attached joint with the manubrium sterni of the sternum to form the sternoclavicular impression. Now we have seen the attachments of the clavicle shows that the anterior surface contains deltoid muscle origin for the deltoid muscle. The anterior surface of the lateral 1/3 contains origin for the deltoid muscle, whereas the posterior surface contains insertion of the trapezius muscle. The medial with 2/3 of the clavicle, the anterior surface contains the origin of pectoralis major, the origin of sternohyoid muscle, and the sternocleidomastoid, and the superior surface contains the origin of sternocleidomastoid muscle. Now we have to discuss the clinicals of the clavicle. The clinicals of the clavicles there are two main important clinicals of the clavicle. One is known as cleidocranial dysostosis. Cleidocranial dysostosis is a clinical anatomy in which the clavicle is absent by birth. The cleidocranial dysostosis is a clinical anatomy in which the clavicle is absent. Whereas the second condition and the second clinical anatomy is that in which when a person falls on a condition in which he had outstretched hands, the clavicle, the most common point for the breakage of the clavicle is that where the concave, the lateral and medial, where the lateral and medial part joins together. This is one of the most important point for the PCQ purpose, that the point where the clavicle breaks most is the point where the lateral and medial end of the clavicle joins. Now one of the important point for the BCQ point of view is that whenever we fall on outstretched hand, the clavicle breaks at this point. The lateral surface always goes down. The lateral surface always goes down. Just this is because of this. It always goes down just like this. I know that you can imagine. Suppose this is the lateral end, this is the medial end, and these are joined together like this. Whenever we fall on an outstretched hand, this is the lateral end, this is the medial end. They break like this. This is because the clavicle alone cannot. Bear all the clavicle alone cannot. The lateral end just contain a trapezoid ridge and cannot bear the entire weight of the limb. That is all about the anatomy of the clavicle. If you want to make notes, you can take a screenshot of this page. That will definitely going to help you in your exams point of view. Okay, now thank you very much. If you like this video, please like, comment and subscribe, and add me on a Snapchat. This is Fahadni7. Thank you.